Welcome again, everyone, and we're looking at land investment and territory today. Of course, we've had a previous session on land and tenure, and this very much builds on the debates and discussions that we had in that session. And specifically in today's session, we're looking at the drivers, implications, and outcomes of large-scale investments in infrastructure, land and resources, and pastoralist areas. No longer seen as threatening borderlands in need of pacification, or low-potential wastelands that can be ignored, in public and policy imaginations, these areas are now seen as frontiers with abundant land and resources that can be exploited for national wealth. The newly important positioning of pastoralist frontiers in national development strategies and economic planning is a sudden shift following decades of underinvestment, marginalization, and neglect by post-colonial governments. Ports, pipelines, roads, wind farms, and plantations are all linked in the grand modernist visions of states and large private capital. Large-scale investments are often seen somewhat benignly as part of wider commercialization and growth dynamics, and even a precursor to peace building and the creation of what are thought to be resilient livelihoods for pastoralists, who are still widely viewed as backwards by states. Many powerful actors are involved, from international corporates to states and local elites, but important questions are raised about who benefits and who loses out, and whether such large-scale projects do indeed deliver poverty-reducing development, as is often claimed. As we will see, this new emphasis on developing pastoralist areas through investment in resources, land infrastructure, and small towns is resulting in new territorializations, contentious politics, and social difference. And so there are three questions that anchor our reflections for today. First, what do investments look like in these places, and who frames their meaning, interpretation, and pursuit? Second, how are investments generating wider impacts, and who loses and wins? And finally, what types of resistance, mobilization, subversion, and forms of contentious politics are evident around these processes? And we want to start with debates around the global land rush to help us frame and provide context for discussions around investments and new territorializations in pastoral areas. Land-based investments and land deals have multiplied around the world since 2008. John Galati details three factors that are often mentioned as drivers behind this upsurge in an interest in acquiring land. Firstly, food shortfalls and the resultant rise in food commodity prices in 2008, which indicated that farmland could represent a lucrative investment. Second, the relative decline in available land in both the industrialized and middle-income countries, a condition heightened in wealthy yet farmland-poor nations such as Saudi Arabia. And finally, the perception that in some developing countries, abundant land with agricultural potential was underutilized, cheap, and available. On this last point, many governments have argued that they have vast tracts of empty, marginal, uncultivated, or inefficiently used land that can be used more profitably for commercial agriculture. Thus, as Ian and others have explained in their work on land grabbing, justifications for land acquisitions are framed by narratives of scarcity and abundance, and at both local and global scales. This underlies and helps us understand the various connections between investors based in wealthier industrialized countries such as China and Gulf states, and countries in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, where more land acquisitions have taken place, as the figure on the left shows. Tanya Lee makes the point that the mechanisms, processes, or impacts of the post-2008 rush are not without precedent, referring to the South Sea Bubble in 1720, or for tulips in Holland in 1636, or earlier rushes for gold. But what is distinctive about land acquisitions over the past decade is its temporality and scope. But what is also notable about the recent global land rush is its geography. An estimated 70% of the land transacted in large-scale transnational deals in recent years were in Africa, as the figure on the right shows, that rescales each country in proportion to the amount of land that has been acquired by foreign investors since 2006. Rather than the process of land becoming a global commodity representing the outcome of a historical expansion of property rights and the rule of law, it is in fact usually representative of the abrogation of rights of landholders by the state in the interests of elites and investors, as John Galati argues. To this point, Tanya Lee explains that, counter to the argument that the rule of law and clear rights to land are prerequisites for investment, large-scale land deals feed on fuzziness. Whether land is available does not refer to whether those with legitimate land rights are willing to part with it, but whether a firm can make an arrangement with political elites to acquire land by fiat, usually in the absence of consent or awareness of those holding the land in question. Taking this further, Lee cautions that consent can become a means of dispossession when a customary chief who claims to have jurisdiction over communal land signs off on a land deal without consulting the people who are affected. The book Africa's Land Rush assessed the early impacts and influences of the post-2008 land-based investments. It found that while land deals often entailed enclaved investments and the recreation of agrarian dualism, on closer inspection patterns of change were more varied. Not all investments involved dispossession, as critics feared they would, nor implied a simple incorporation into global capitalism. Instead, it concluded that the fate of African smallholders rested on the terms of their incorporation in deals, something requiring attention to multiple processes relating to labor, technology, expertise, markets, as well as land. Referring to Tanya Lee again, based on cases she has studied involving villages beside massive oil palm plantations in the Indonesian island of Kalimantan, she adds to this assessment by showing that villagers do sometimes consent to land investments, and they do so for many reasons, including the hope of benefiting from new infrastructure, more jobs or better wages, and access to schooling. In short, the quote-unquote local community is not singular, and the potential for enrolling villagers may be bigger than first appears, according to Lee. The outcomes of large investments are thus uncertain and contingent on a number of coinciding processes of commercialization, commodification, financialization of land resources and agriculture, as well as responses to these by residents of communities in investment areas. So this brief overview of debates on land grabbing sets up our consideration of investments in pastoral areas. To be clear, not all of these are investments in land. They also include exploration for oil and gas, efforts to harness green energy like wind and geothermal, infrastructure like roads and airports, and also abattoirs and other infrastructure for encouraging greater livestock marketing. Common to both wider debates on the global land rush and narrower discussions around investments in pastoral areas is the notion of the frontier. Official explanations and justifications for large-scale investment in pastoralist areas often speak to frontier discourses of growing economies and improving lives through the transformative power of large and capital-intensive projects. Although imaginations of the frontier reflect critical nuances in geography, culture, politics, and society, as an idea that is fundamentally about civilization and progress, it owes much to Frederick Jackson Turner's conceptualization of the American westward expansion in the 19th and early 20th centuries. While the American expansion was associated with rugged individualism and the Wild West, the frontier of today's large-scale investment in pastoral areas has more in common with a penetration-type spread of capitalist relations and the reassertion of centralized state power. This is not the wagons and pioneer families moving west in search of a better life. These are Learjets and executives of FTSE-listed oil, mining, and biofuel companies in search of new resource wealth. These are convoys of land cruisers ferrying ministers and presidential advisors from capital cities to sites where projects are imagined or unfolding. In both cases, frontiers represent the discovery or invention of new resources: land for commercial agricultural enterprises, hydrocarbon reservoirs beneath rangelands, other energy from subterranean steam and wind, and even pastoral populations themselves to be drawn into wider markets for everything from pasteurized, long-life milk to mobile phones and online betting. As Jason Mosley and Liz Watson explain for East Africa, large-scale investments are inseparable from state visions of throwing off aid dependency and achieving rapid economic growth and national transformation. Thus, states are discovering resources in pastoral areas that can sustain national economic development and ambitions to rapidly industrialize. Rasmussen and Lund point out that frontier dynamics do not only happen in geographically distant places. The dynamics that link space and resources are not a function of mere distance, but a particular configuration of values and institutions related to the advancement of extraction and commodification as defining features of capitalist development. Or as Danilo Geiger explains based on evidence from Latin America and Asia, the frontier is a zone of destruction of property systems, political structures, social relations, and life worlds to make way for new ways of resource extraction. The frontier is not a boundary between civilization and wilderness, argue Detlef Muller-Mann and Konrad Schetter, but rather a relational space that is characterized by interaction, connections, and conflict. Frontier dynamics emerge from the messiness of competing spatial imaginations and disputes over territorial claims, as existing institutional orders are unsettled, uprooted, and ultimately reconfigured as new kinds of resources become subject to governance. So what we want to do in the next part of the session is to look at different ways that investments are seen. States look at these differently from how global capital investors see these. They look at these differently from how rural capital looks at these. Rural capital looks at these different from how pastoralists see these investments. So we want to take each of these categories in turn and look at the different perceptions and ways of interaction with new investments at the margins. So starting with seeing like a state, the promotion of large-scale investments in pastoral areas in Eastern Africa is part of a wider vision of regional economic integration and transformation of the rural frontier. From the perspective of states in the region, large-scale infrastructure and resource developments are part of a vision of developing the frontiers that is benign and even positive by connecting remote rural areas to larger markets and improving their accessibility for outside investors as well as government departments. Integration involving investment in trade and transport corridors to move goods, services, and people between coasts and resource-rich hinterlands is thus taken as part of development and economic growth, and even bringing peace to restive pastoral areas. Such corridors, like these you see on the maps on this slide, are often quintessential high modernist projects, as James Scott explained in his 1998 book, Seen Like a State. Scott defines high modernism variously throughout the book, but its ideological variants usually incorporate a sweeping rational engineering of all aspects of social life in order to improve the human condition. In Tanya Lee's words, high modernist projects like growth corridors are framed by a so-called, quote, will to improve by development donors and states, in line with a particular vision of progress. Central to Scott's thesis is the idea of legibility. and he explains how he stumbled across the idea while researching efforts by nation-states to settle or sedentarize nomads, pastoralists, gypsies, and other peoples living non-mainstream lives. He wrote, "The more I examined these efforts at sedentarization, the more I came to see them as a state's attempt to make a society legible, to arrange the population in ways that simplified the classic state functions of taxation, conscription, and prevention of rebellion. Having begun to think in these terms, I began to see legibility as a central problem in statecraft. The pre-modern state was, in many crucial respects, particularly blind. It knew precious little about its subjects, their wealth, their land holdings and yields, their location, their very identity. It lacked anything like a detailed map of its terrain and its people." The book is about 2 to 3 century-long processes by which modern states reorganized the societies they governed to make them more legible to the apparatus of governance. The state is not actually interested in the rich functional structure and complex behavior of the very organic entities that it governs. It merely views them as resources that must be organized in order to yield optimal returns according to a centralized, narrow, and strictly utilitarian logic. So seeing like a state assumes a particular form in the relationship between a highland-centric state in Kenya and Ethiopia and peripheral pastoral areas, often by way of the civilizing mission of settlement projects, irrigation schemes, road building, and the provision of basic services. In the Ethiopian lowlands, Asebe Regasa and colleagues explain that land grabbing takes the form of state-mediated commercialization, agribusiness deals that provide a mechanism to thicken state presence through forced dispossession and coercive sedentarization practices, to absorb what are seen to be underutilized spaces into productive uses for the state. They explain that the state thickens through the presence of police and military giving protection to these investors, and through implementing new technologies of governing pastoral subjects under the rubric of development and improvement, whereby the state apparatus and the ruling party work hand in hand with private investors. This style of development in turn generates a style of technopolitics, where certain types of expertise and technological intervention are privileged, each with exclusionary characteristics. A homogenized, standardized, grid-like imposition emerges in the plans. Embedded within state plans in Eastern Africa is a heavy emphasis on the notion of unlocking potential in particular pastoral and peripheral farming areas. The development of coal and oil reserves alongside wind and geothermal, mostly in the rural drylands, are integral elements of Kenya's Vision 2030 National Development Blueprint. The formalization of the livestock sector, including the expansion of corridor infrastructure, feedlots, and processing facilities, feature in Ethiopia's second Growth and Transformation Plan. This builds on existing wider efforts by the state to promote the export and trade of livestock, most of which is supplied by pastoralists that have long been marginalized by a state dominated by highland agrarian interests. Uganda's second National Development Plan aims to enable continued upstream capital investment by global companies in oil and gas exploration and appraisal in the Albertine Rift, which reached $2.5 billion by the year 2013. A different spatiality and way of seeing large-scale projects emerges from the perspective of global capital investors. As James Ferguson argued in a 2005 article on Seeing Like an Oil Company, which was later reprised in his book You See Here on Global Shadows, the model of seeing like a state is upset in the neoliberal world where developmental states in Africa have less reach and traction. Ferguson detailed an optic of global capital investment in territorialized enclaves for resource extraction. Writing during the commodities boom in the early 2000s, Ferguson observed how, and I quote, "capital does not flow from London to Cabinda. It hops, neatly skipping over most of what lies in between. When capital is invested in spatially segregated mineral extraction enclaves, the flow of capital does not cover the globe, it connects discrete points on it. In his analysis, extractive operations are characterized by the intensive exploitation of separately administered enclaves that are, in his words, sharply walled off from their own national societies, with little or no economic benefit to wider society. Ferguson deliberately contrasted this type of spatialized political order with the standardized national grids envisioned in Scott's Scene Like a State. To Ferguson, the characteristic mode of seeing by global oil companies has not entailed homogenization within a national grid, but rather the establishment of highly securitized pockets, often in areas with chronic violent insecurity and weakened central government authority. These have their own security and state-like features as capital hops between disparate sites where rule, order, and capitalist accumulation can be assured. The implication was that resource extraction could advance untouched by surrounding low-level violence and politics. Different ways of seeing, like a state or global investor, entwine in these developments, to be sure. The expansion of national grids into remote rural areas happens alongside the carving out of pockets and strips of territory to harness and remove resource wealth. As Rasmussen and Lund explained, territorialization is a strategy of using bounded spaces for particular outcomes. A resource control strategy that involves classification of particular areas in order to regulate people and resources. Although states are often privileged as territorializing agents, the spread of extractive green energy and commercial agriculture projects in pastoral areas shows how non-state actors and organizations also have capabilities to territorialize. An example of this on the slide shows the rangelands of southern Turkana, where an infrastructure for oil exploration and appraisal was established since 2010 by an investor consortium led by the Anglo-Irish company Tullow Oil. The pinpricks in the center of the satellite photo and near the bottom are fenced exploratory wells, while near the top a larger excision is visible indicating the 2 by 1 kilometer Kapese base established by the Kenyan company African Camp Solutions, or ACS, which includes an airstrip, accommodation, offices, and storage facilities for Tullow and other large oil subcontracting firms. Rasmussen and Lund show that territorialization involves a series of operations that include establishing a territorial administration, instituting a legal system, and with it the creation of rights subjects and laws of property, establishing of boundaries and mapping of space, and critically ensuring the capacity to enforce any and all of this by means of force, if necessary. In the case of the Kapese base, ACS, or African Camp Solutions, agreed the land transfer with local officials, including the area's member of the county assembly and the area chief. ACS sought the consent of local leaders, including elders and an influential seer as well. A deal was signed off in which ACS pledged to pay the Turkana County government 4 million Kenya shillings a month in leasing fees, a fraction of what it is thought to earn in income it takes from leasing the use of facilities to Tullow and other subcontractors. The Kapese deal spurred opposition and claims that the company bought the support of local leaders. Tullow has faced similar tensions in its efforts to acquire land for exploration wells. The company has negotiated land takes on a case-by-case basis involving various stakeholders from communities in the immediate vicinity of well sites, including elders, seers, and young people. Many have come to see both elders and seers, who were revered and highly respected individuals in Turkana custom, as self-interested because of their part in endorsing deals that deliver few wider public benefits, but that do extend momentary reward and enrichment for small numbers of people near to sites of extractive activity. While the optic of modernity and prosperity spreading outwards into underdeveloped peripheries is integral to state visions of development throughout the region, and it undergirds investor faith in securing social acceptance of operations, these large projects often appear very different from the margins. Large-scale investments in pastoral areas of Eastern Africa happen in parallel to the slow but steady rise in indigenous capital amongst town-based entrepreneurs, transporters, livestock traders, and political brokers. Benedict Korf and colleagues argue that indigenous capital has become an important driver in territorialization processes in pastoral areas. They focus on Ethiopia's Somali region, which they explain has experienced a kind of indigenization of sedentarization since the late 1990s at the hands of Somali investors, traders, and entrepreneurs. An economic rush in the region, incentivized by transnational marketing networks, has seen the rapid commodification of pastoral resources, such as charcoal, water points, and cash crops. These have combined with sovereign state claims to territory, such as to establish irrigation and commercial agriculture schemes, to produce new patterns of territorialization. As pastoralist entrepreneurs covet monetized dryland resources, they become complicit in the state's project of territorialization and vision of a sedentarized pastoralist society. Korf and his colleagues state, the contemporary frontiersman in African drylands thus resembles less a state-backed settler than a post-pastoral capitalist who acts as a partly self-governing frontier entrepreneur. Improvements in roads and transport services are making markets and basic services more accessible for pastoral populations, helping to lift the position of indigenous rural capital, while at the same time supporting the penetration of outside capital. While certain investments in roads, transport, and marketing infrastructure by states can represent a welcome injection of public resources in pastoral areas and address historic marginalization in these areas, its outcomes can be ambiguous. Drawing on longitudinal evidence from the Borana Plateau in southern Ethiopia, John McPeak and Peter Little observed that transport improvements can create new opportunities for livestock marketing and value-added processing, but it is by no means clear that the benefits to the majority of dryland residents will outweigh the costs, given trends that have seen accelerating concentration of wealth amongst the better off. Examples abound in pastoral areas of Eastern Africa of land and resource grabbing, or of pastoralists making ill-informed sales of individual land holdings. A land rush in Kenya's South Rift Valley, driven by speculators spurred by the area's proximity to Nairobi, and Maasai distress sales, has seen the rangeland become highly fragmented as the area transitions into a peri-urban frontier. This has left many Maasai worse off through a process that Maasai explain as, quote-unquote, selling wealth to buy poverty, whereby Maasai sell their plots within group ranches to buyers, worsening fragmentation and further undermining the requirements for livestock keeping in the area. Thus, seen as indigenous or rural capital in pastoral Eastern Africa entails seizing opportunities apparent in regional demands for rangeland resources, booming markets for livestock and livestock products, as well as state investment in infrastructure and land. Capital investment in irrigated plots, water points, private feedlots, and town property by local and transnational Somali merchants in Jijiga and other towns in Ethiopia's Somali region has accelerated sedentarization, while fueling the rise of a regional investor class. In Karamoja, a pastoral region in northeastern Uganda, a rental market has expanded rapidly, as well-off Karamojong construct housing for recent migrants. These developments are happening in parallel to continued investment in livestock production by pastoralist elites. A regional trade in livestock and meat, was $1 billion in 2010. Exports of carcasses and live animals through the Gulf of Aden ports mean that this has increased further yet. This trade has concentrated wealth amongst frontier capitalists, as many poor pastoralists sell up and exit livestock keeping. Besides investments in livestock, land, and rental properties in growing towns, indigenous capital has flowed into transport, ranging from lorries and private hire vehicles to motorbikes, petrol stations, and mechanic shops. As Jamie Cross argues, scholars have often been too ready to assume that the kinds of transformations that large-scale capitalist development will generate will be top-down and driven by the powerful. His study of the economy of anticipation, provoked by plans for special economic zones in Andhra Pradesh and India, shows that it is not only the interests of big capital and powerful government elites that drive the reshaping of the local places where such projects are located, but also the anticipatory actions of ordinary people. Similarly, while the Kenyan government's $23 billion Lapset Corridor project promises to make Isiolo town in northern Kenya into an economic hub along the corridor, it has thus far largely been the actions of ordinary people that have propelled the town's transformation. As Hannah Elliott shows, Lapset plans have set in motion an economy of anticipation in Isiolo, as diverse actors rush to property land at the town's edges, that is, to collectively and individually lay exclusive claims to it. While these actions are undoubtedly related to the rapidly rising value of land in the town and its environs, and thus residents' demands for economic inclusion, Elliott shows that propertying is also a means through which residents seek to ensure their political inclusion. But what about pastoralists? Rangelands have been carved up through the establishment of private enclosures, water points and cisterns, farmlands, ranches and conservation areas, and other large-scale investments. But how do pastoralists see and experience these? As Ian's defining work on Living with Uncertainty made clear, pastoralism as a type of land use depends on access to key reserved resources, such as riparian areas along rivers or hilltop forests, both seasonally and during more serious droughts. Pastoralists also depend on mobility and access routes to track spatially and temporally distributed resources, access markets, and other functions. From the perspective of pastoralists who depend on extensive resource use and rite of passage and movement between different parts of a highly variable and differentiated landscape, new territorializations resulting from both large-scale and indigenous investments are a considerable challenge. Rangeland fragmentation constrains traditional mobile pastoralism as movements become more difficult to make, and key resource areas are fenced and set aside for non-livestock uses. As Tanya Lee writes, although often treated as a thing and sometimes as a commodity, turning land into alternative productive uses requires regimes of exclusion that distinguish legitimate from illegitimate uses and users, and inscribing boundaries through devices such as fences, title deeds, or other legal documents and regulations. In mobile pastoral systems, land is both passage and a seasonal resource bank. To the state, it is something investable through the use of technologies, discourses, as we've seen, and also through the selective application of law to assign new exclusive rights. To a global investor, it may be nothing more than an operational space that needs to be secured from other uses for the unimpeded extraction of subterranean steam, oil and gas, or above-ground wind. For post-pastoralist capitalists, land is something still altogether different, something to claim for speculative reasons, anticipating future wealth creation as the value of land increases, and or to stake claims to belonging, and thus rights to future compensation, political representation, and power. Patterns of rangeland fragmentation associated with indigenous capital in pastoral areas intersect with the current wave of large-scale infrastructural investments, resulting in new land contestations in these previously marginalized areas. Rangeland fragmentation is also hastened by internal processes of sedentarization in resource claims making in pastoral societies. In Harshin, which is traditionally an important drought grazing reserve, lying on a strategic trekking route for livestock that are being exported from Ethiopia and Somaliland through the Gulf of Aden port of Berbera, there's been a near total privatization of grazing areas and water, as the rangeland was carved into household plots for farming and private grazing. Back in Kenya, based on experiences from Baringo County, Clemens Greiner documents the rapid spread of dryland farming among the pastoral Pokot on the one hand, and the early stages of large-scale investments in the exploitation of geothermal power on the other hand. He shows how both processes increasingly converge and mutually reinforce each other in ways that lead to profound competition and re-evaluation of land. Seen from the margins, struggles around the framing and meanings given to resources, whether they are geothermal superheated steam, oil, or land, are the crux of many contestations in pastoral areas. Residents of areas where large projects are proposed or taking shape frame their claims variously, employing in particular discourses around ecology, ethnicity, and social justice. Extraction channels resource claims into a so-called rights talk that speaks to questions of local identity, territory, citizenship, and the rights stemming from these. Contestations around oil exploration activities connect to a social body beyond the enclave, underscoring the enmeshing of oil extraction with wider politics and governance. The operations of oil explorers, as well as the benefits of oil development and how these are shared, are highly governed and mediated through a number of relationships at all levels, from the global, regional, and national, all the way down to the subnational administrative unit, town, and village. Ultimately, there is no uniform view amongst pastoralists on the impacts of large-scale projects. Social difference having to do with age and gender, but also wealth, social standing, and relative levels of influence matters a great deal in terms of assessing both pastoralist perceptions as well as the outcomes of new investment in economic change. As Fiona Flinton shows in an assessment of rangeland fragmentation dynamics across pastoral areas of Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda, it is clear that some pastoralists are benefiting from processes of investment, while many others lose out. In general, those who benefit are more powerful and have greater assets on hand, which they can use to influence decision makers and land allocations, enclose property, build up their herds, and make the most of new livelihood diversification opportunities. For the poor, the situation has become critical. They are no longer able to access common property resources upon which they relied. Competition and conflict over resources is increasing, often with loss of life. They are losing control over their lives and are increasingly vulnerable to crises such as drought. So investments, be they in roads, pipelines, irrigation schemes, oil wells, geothermal plants, or wind turbines, all entail the increased presence of the state and the interests of centralized state power alongside those of global finance and large companies involved in developing the frontier. They have profound implications for governance and local politics at the rural periphery. Yet we have seen that it is not only ways of seeing like a state or a global capital investor that matter to understanding what happens to society, politics, and governance in pastoral areas. Ways of seeing like indigenous or rural capital and like a pastoralist matter significantly for understanding what happens to livelihoods and local economies, to the nature and shape of conflict in these places, including how it is framed, experienced, and responded to. In practice, neither a state-driven modernist plan nor enclave capitalism is the result. As Ian details in his work with Rebecca Smalley on corridor development in Eastern Africa's seaboard. Local contexts and political negotiations result in many hybrids, as different visions compete and converge. State plans often fall apart as the realities of contexts at the pastoral margins impinge or morph into a new project that is more closely aligned with local capital interests. While enclaves can never fully isolate themselves and must articulate with other forms of local capitalism, politics, and resistance on the ground. Governments and investors may introduce local compensation schemes and use local gatekeepers to champion development, though often without fully grasping community experiences of and responses to the increased presence and control of the state and non-state actors that is implied in new extractive development. Returning to Turkana, instead of by writ of enclavization, the establishment of an infrastructure for oil extraction in Turkana has happened through ties that Tullow, the lead explorer in the region, has cultivated with county government officials, emergent local capital in the area, and other community voices that are influencing public attitudes. Extractive activities have ignited debates around belonging, entitlements, and inclusion as oil investors have sought to curry favor with communities and stem any potential resistance. Mirroring the behavior of Kenya's national political elites to advance private wealth, county politicians and officials have used their positions to leverage local capital by insisting on more contracts for local companies. Like national officials, they have also sought to derive patronage from Tullow by pressuring the company to create more work opportunities, social investments, as well as funding infrastructure in the area. Thus, as the anthropologist Doris Okenwa details in her new work on Turkana's oil development, as a way to secure local support or at least acceptance of oil operations, oil investors created casual work opportunities for local residents, financed projects such as building school dormitories and water points, and compensated residents directly affected by construction and drilling. Community engagement is a placemaking project, she argues, and a relational process of soliciting cooperation that produces situated identities. Investor efforts to partner with so-called community members takes on material forms as local residents navigate homogenizing categories and templates to assert their own understanding of what a community is, who should be included, and thus who has a right to benefit. As struggles have ensued to define what and who exactly is, quote-unquote, the community, oil development has fueled new articulations of citizenship, inclusion, and claims-making. As Okenwa explains, company efforts to encourage participation does not ensure equitable distribution, or alter the social forces that perpetuate inequality. Rather, it creates new kinds of subjectivities and social relations that emphasize particular knowledge systems and essentialist ideas of the community. So, in summary, over the past decade, the level and range of public and private investments in pastoral areas has expanded significantly. The drive for investment in pastoral areas has a long history, from irrigation schemes and livestock marketing and ranching schemes promoted by governments and donors more than 50 years ago, through the incremental expansion of mining, oil, and geothermal exploration and extraction operations in the 1980s and 1990s, up to the more recent wave of investment in corridors, land, resources, and expanding towns. Debates at the start of the recent investment rush turned on headline-grabbing figures of the size of proposed projects, such as the $23 billion price tag for Kenya's Lapset program, or the scale of the proposed land takes for commercial agriculture, such as the 300,000 hectare land lease since cancelled to an Indian company in Ethiopia's Gambela region. The reality has panned out differently in many cases. large-scale investments have advanced in a more piecemeal way as challenges of implementation have mounted. Lapset's grand modernist vision has not materialized in a sudden multi-billion-dollar bang, but rather emerged incrementally, such as through the completion of the Isiolo-Moyale Highway in Kenya and the recent opening of Isiolo's airport. Mass expropriations to establish large-scale commercial farms in Ethiopia and Tanzania have by and large not come to pass, as only a small part of an agreed area is actually farmed. Still, the reconfiguration of land ownership and use, while perhaps not as dramatic as the land-grabbing debate feared, has been profound, creating a new politics of land and investment in pastoral regions. Proposed infrastructure and investments have ignited intense competition for and reevaluation of land, as local elites and other domestic and foreign investors jostle to claim tracts of land. As we've seen, development of oil, wind, and geothermal reserves has fueled other competitions around so-called local content, an industry term for procuring goods and services from local suppliers and workers. The footprint of these developments and the arrival of workers and contractors from outside of local areas sit uncomfortably with the reality of work opportunities that are thinly spread and temporary in these places. And what you see here on this slide then is a list of some of the key impacts of resource and infrastructure investments happening in pastoral areas. So to conclude, the spread of large-scale investments in pastoral areas, the political and economic interests that are driving them, and the new valuing of land and resources they introduce reshape the politics of resource contestations in different places. These politics matter for how security in pastoral margins can be governed, for whom and in whose interests. Central governments and investors often view any conflict as localized disturbance that can be overcome through the provision of more state and private security, through corporate social investment, and through deals that incentivize local acceptance. In other words, the governance of investor operations can be largely contained in enclaves and made separate from wider political and social relations. However, state and global investor capital is unable to wall itself off. It has to navigate a spectrum of local interests. National government, or the state if you like, is unable to impose its will without striking deals and cultivating ties within political society at the margins. It is the entwining of different ways of seeing, as an oil company, as a national government or a local government, as indigenous or rural capital, or as a local land user, and the logics and interests associated with these that define the political topography of extractive landscapes and the governance of contestations and struggles around these.